Welcome, everyone. Welcome back. Just happy to introduce Greg Jenks for our talk this afternoon. Creative title, The Nazareth of Jesus, which I think is very significant for understanding the context and the social dimensions of first century life. So I look forward to Greg's talk, and I just wanted to say, Greg, if you don't mind, I apologize for my comments over lunch.
I thought you were talking about Brandon.
The beginning of wisdom is knowing that you don't know. So if we don't start there, we probably haven't understood what wisdom is about. Welcome, Greg.
Okay, thank you, David. You've got to love philosophers. Well, they think they can think. So that's different from us who think we know, but we don't. No, it's all part of the collegiality. One of the things I have really enjoyed about Weststar over the years has been the collegiality and the community relationships that build up. And I know that's true of Snowstar because I've been around in the background at Snowstar for a number of years. And it's also interesting, like one of the things I most enjoy about the dig at Bethsaida. It's fun when you find something, but actually what's really fun is it's the same group of people going back every year, and it's like summer camp for Bible scholars who know nothing, but it's summer camp for Bible scholars to come back and drink and make the students do all the work. And this is being recorded, so I shouldn't say too much more. But it's that human collegiality dimension, which is actually way more important than the stuff we say we're on about. Okay, it's actually how we create community and do great stuff, good stuff together. Let me just say a couple of things before I get into this afternoon's topic more directly. What I'll be doing in many ways is to draw on some of the work from Bethsaida Archaeology Project, but really to focus on Nazareth. And there's a little bit of a story as to how that came about. So I'm not going to be discussing the Bethsaida dig as such, and although you'll find when you do get your copies of the book, that especially the first few chapters do draw quite deliberately on some of that work. But I'm happy to address some of those issues when we get, say, to the Q&A section in a little bit later. Part of the background was that, as I mentioned yesterday, I was able to spend 5 months or so living in Israel last year, based in Tiberias, about 9 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee. But my most significant connection with the Galilee is not Bethsaida or Tiberias, but a little town called Nazareth, which you've probably heard of. And you'll perhaps know a little bit more about it by the end of this afternoon. And so early on in my stay, I was actually at a concert at the Salesian Church and got into a conversation with one of the local members of the Christian community who was talking about what Nazareth was like in the first century. And being something of a minimalist, I had a much more reduced picture in my mind of the scale and significance of Nazareth at the time. And so we sort of took on this project that he would show me around town and show me the things which would persuade me of his view, and I would put together some of my ideas to persuade him of where I was coming from. Well, I wrote my 6,000 word paper and he never showed me around town, but the paper has since gone on to have a kind of life of its own. It's appeared as a chapter in a book that came out a few weeks ago. It's in the background of some of a section of my new book, and what I'm going to do this afternoon is basically the multimedia version of the published text. So that gives me an excuse to mention the website, gregoryjenks.com, so it's easy to find. And in terms of those who are wanting to see the sort of lectionary note materials, that's what you get as soon as you go onto the site, on the home page. That's the background notes for next Sunday's readings and so on, and previous weeks and such like. Publications, of course, are listed there. And if there's a link to an online version of a chapter, then it's there as well. So, for instance, the the online chapter of what we're talking. Oh, actually, I've taken it down because the publishers aren't that keen to make the links too obvious. But that's the book in which it appears, and I'll show you later on how to find that article as a PDF. And if you're just wanting videos of the talks from this last couple of days or other things I've been doing recently while I've been playing with this new software, you just sort of click on the link for video up here, and it'll take you to this page where you can go on whatever you want. So for instance, there's the talk from yesterday afternoon. Okay, it's there on YouTube. Segue across now to talk about the. Okay, now just briefly in terms of where you might find the stuff, if you go to the academia.edu page, so what I tend to do as I write a chapter for a book, I'll put it up here in draft form. Publishers seem to be able to live with that. And then, so there's the Nazareth here, the quest for the historical Nazareth paper. So if you want the full text of what I'm saying today, which is this beastie, it's about a 6,000 word document, but no pickies, okay? Then it's available there as a PDF. And to my surprise, it's now 924 people have downloaded this project, which was just something to keep me amused while writing the book, for which, of course, I get nothing, but that's all right. It's actually fun to see the material being used. There's obviously a lot more interest in the question of the historicity of Nazareth than I realised when I started doing this project, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. The other thing I should just mention is that, and again you can get to it from the Jesus Then and Now link obviously, there's a study guide available, so you can either download it as a PDF or as an EPUB document. If you do it as an EPUB document, you can look at it on your iPad or other digital device. Okay, you just download these and they're free of charge, but one of the advantages is if you click on the link it takes you straight to it. So that's sort of Malin's website, for instance, which is a fantastic online resource. So if you're using the study guide in the digital version, people don't just have the study guide, they have the live links to all kinds of web resources as well. Now all that's there just available free of charge. So if you are wanting to use the book as a study guide, or even in a study group, or even just to look up some extra resources while reading it for yourself, go to the study guide page and download the version that's going to work for you. Okay, either the PDF or the EPUB version. Okay. So I think that means we're pretty well on track to get started. So let's have a think this afternoon about the Nazareth of Jesus. And as I mentioned yesterday, I'm quite deliberately playing with the other version of that phrase, which is to talk about Jesus of Nazareth. And so this time I'm turning that on its head and saying, well, what do we know about the Nazareth of Jesus, rather than what do we know about Jesus of Nazareth? That's what Nazareth looks like today, depending which kind of angle of the hill you're looking down. Right in the middle of the city is, of course, the great Roman Catholic Basilica of the Annunciation, the largest Christian church in the Middle East, only built in the early 1960s. And even from this photo, you can pick the Franciscan compound, which is just the large brick, red-tiled roof buildings in the immediate vicinity of the basilica. Now, probably the Franciscan compound sits on top of and is no larger than the original first century village of Nazareth. Okay? It's a lot bigger place today. So what's the problem of Nazareth in the first century? It comes as a surprise to many of us to think that there was a problem. We all know that Jesus came from Nazareth. But in fact, like many other things we all know, there's a whole lot of reasons for questioning and wondering, have we got it right? And so there have been significant questions about the existence of Nazareth at all in the time of Jesus, and whether or not Nazareth was invented after Easter, and indeed more into the sort of Byzantine period, to provide a place to celebrate the life of Jesus and the sort of legacy of Jesus, rather than being the place from which he actually came. This, of course, is part of the maximalist-minimalist debate, and by disposition and methodological choice, I'm a minimalist. rather than defend and retreat from one position after another. I prefer to adopt a minimalist position and then work out from there in terms of how might we build religious communities, Christian communities, around this understanding of Scripture or this understanding of Jesus. So whether it's Abraham or Moses or David or Jesus, I tend to adopt by default a fairly minimalist position. So this is one biblical scholar who knows how much he doesn't know. Sometimes. But of course it's also a religious argument, and indeed one particular author who's written a book called The Myth of Nazareth is really somebody coming to terms with his own angst at the Catholic Church. Okay? And unfortunately I think that has affected his capacity to interpret the data objectively and with a clear kind of methodological process. So I hope it's good for him, but I'm not sure it's contributed much to scholarship. This kind of debate, of course, pits the skeptics against traditional believers, and this particular Myth of Nazareth debate has done exactly that. And for someone like myself, who's very connected to Nazareth, the contemporary Nazareth, that's of course a dilemma in its own right. Just as the folk in Bethlehem don't like it when I say Jesus was probably born in Nazareth, the people in Nazareth are not too impressed when I remind them how small Nazareth might have been and how insignificant it may have been at the time. So it's an interesting thing for me to observe my own reactions as scholar and human, because you can be both, given my attachment to Nazareth and my critical disengagement from the importance of any one particular place or one particular tradition. So, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus from Nazareth. There are 29 references to the place Nazareth in the Bible, and all of them are in the New Testament. This is part of the problem. This place is never mentioned until we get to the Gospels, and is never mentioned after the Gospels, except for Acts, which is really part of the Gospel tradition, Luke, Acts. So outside Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John and Acts, Nazareth is never mentioned in the ancient literature. Not in the biblical literature, not in the post-biblical literature, not in the non-religious literature of the ancient world. So did the place exist outside the imagination of the Gospel writers? That's the dilemma. Almost all of those 29 references, but not all of them, but almost all of them are in the phrase Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus from Nazareth. Occasionally you'll get a reference, and he came to Nazareth where he was brought up or something like that. But mostly it's in the phrase Jesus of Nazareth. So it appears to be a way of describing Jesus when he's somewhere else. Oh, this is the Yeshua from Nazareth, not the Yeshua, which was a very common name for Jewish boys at the time. So there were lots of Jesuses. That's another one of the kind of reality checks. Miriam or Mary and Salome were the most popular names for girls, Jewish girls, and of course Yeshua or Joshua was one of the most popular names for boys in the period. So this Yeshua, this Jesus, he's the guy from Nazareth. And by the sound of it, there may not have been too many people from Nazareth anyway. So Jesus was a common name, Nazareth was a rare location, so by combining the name with his birthplace, you get a distinctive way of referring to him. Yeshua, the guy from Nazareth up there on the hill. This is a famous line drawing lithograph of Nazareth about 200 years ago. And it wasn't much different from that, probably from the Byzantine period onward. Its heyday was the Byzantine period, and then of course the last 50 years. So it was a fairly small village in the hills, in the sort of southern hill country of the Galilee. Today it has a population around 65,000 people. In 1948 it was 18,000, in 1918, beginning of the British Mandate, it was 8,000 people. In the 1890s it was just a little bit less, 7,500. Probably through most of the post-Byzantine Crusader Islamic Ottoman period, you're probably looking at a population of not more than 1,000 to 1,500 people. Very small place. massive explosion in population, largely due to internally displaced Palestinians being expelled from ethnically cleansed villages in the Galilee and pushed in towards Nazareth, which today is the largest Arab town in Israel, and it's very much the cultural and academic centre for Arab-Israeli cultural traditions. It's well attested in the Crusader period and the Byzantine period, as we'd expect. But what's the evidence for its existence prior to the Byzantine period? Has it been created or invented to serve the needs of the pilgrims? That's certainly a possibility. And I didn't begin this kind of research with any sense that Nazareth must have been there. I was certainly very open to the possibility that Nazareth was just a place which was created around the tradition of Jesus rather than the place that he actually came from. Of course, part of the debate is both familiar and irrelevant in terms of archaeologists. Whether or not Nazareth existed is a different question from, is the present location of Nazareth the ancient location of Nazareth? And that's a problem archaeologists have all over the place. At Bethsaida, are we digging up Bethsaida or some other place, which we simply mistake for Bethsaida? It's clear we're digging up not only a significant village and possibly city from the early Roman period, but to our surprise, a substantial Iron Age city, which of course was not called Bethsaida, but it's on the same location. So the question of naming a site and locating a site is a different question from, did Nazareth exist? Okay, so even if we could demonstrate that the site is wrong, that would not establish that Nazareth itself did not exist in the time of Jesus. I think the myth of Nazareth debate also overstates the significance of the issue for religion. Yes, it would be embarrassing to the Catholic Church in particular to have built the basilica in the wrong place. Okay, but if we built the basilica there, it's obviously the right place, isn't it? I mean, that's the other argument, which is certainly used by the Franciscans. So, in one sense, it does not matter. In another sense, it's an interesting question of the interplay between history and church and faith and pilgrimage and how we construct the past when trying to imagine the future. And I was really interested before that issue that came up about whether Jesus was married. One level, who cares? But what I find interesting is that we do care. And that we find it so difficult to imagine a fully sexualized Jesus. What is going on with our theology of the human if we can't imagine Jesus as a fully sexualized human being? What sort of a weirdo would he have been? Okay, so we're saying something about ourselves rather than about Jesus, and that's of course one of the subtexts in my new book. When we're looking for Jesus, we're actually looking for ourselves. So Galilee, significant cultural influence for what we're talking about, and in the last 2 or 3 decades, it's been the focus of immense, fresh, and significant archaeological research. As Brandon said yesterday, empire has its privileges. And in the case of Israeli archaeology, occupation has its privileges. And there are Israeli archaeologists all over the place with happy volunteers from Australia and Canada and the US, wherever, coming along to help dig up the title deeds to the land for the modern Israelis. So there have been significant advances made in the last couple of decades in terms of our knowledge of the material culture of the Galilee. Whereas previously we relied on the literary accounts of the Gospels and Josephus in particular, now we're able to put alongside the literature hard data coming out of the archaeological fieldwork of the last 20 or 30 years. And one of the delights for me in the last few years has been to find myself working alongside John Kloppenborg, the Q scholar from Toronto, who also digs at Bethsaida. Now, of course, he's looking for Q. Okay, he wants to find the first critical edition of Q, complete with marginal notes. Okay, we tried to help him out a couple of years ago. We bought some, those plastic alphabet you can put on the fridge door. We brought along a pink Q, and we put it in his bucket as he was digging, and he took it to the sifter, and he's poured it on the sifter, and he's going backwards and forwards. We're all standing around watching, trying not to be too obvious. And he's flicking, he picks up a bit of plastic, throws it over his shoulder. We said, "John, you just threw out Q." So it's interesting watching, and it's a great delight to work alongside literary, textual scholars who, of course, are also getting their hands dirty, getting involved. And one of the things we're coming to appreciate is the significant cultural change that was happening in the Galilee during the 1st century BCE and CE. And in essence, it's a process of intentional Judaization of the Galilee. From the Hasmonean rulers around about 100 BCE, an unsuccessful attempt to change the ethnic character of the Galilee by introducing Jewish settlement, sounds awfully familiar, from Jerusalem and Judea into the north to consolidate sort of Jewish presence. It didn't work out in the time of the Hasmoneans, but it did work out in the time of Herod, as in Herod the Great. And so what we're dealing with, it seems, are an intentional process of small Jewish agricultural settlements, villages, who actually have a high attachment to Jerusalem and who choose to buy Jewish rather than Gentile in terms of pottery and lamps, and the cultural markers that we're finding point to an intentional and distinctive Torah observant Jewish population in the Galilee. And this then bumps up against some of the literary reconstructions of Galilee, particularly the Gentile Galilee and the Gentile Sepphoris idea. So we have small agricultural settlements, highly attached to Jerusalem and its temple, and we're also increasingly aware of the competition between Antipas and Philip, two of the sons of Herod, who were given rule or authority over different sections of the north in the years following Herod's death. And of course the whole of Jesus' life, down to the time of his death, fits within the period when Antipas and Philip are competing for each other, basically for influence with Rome, and the point of their competition is the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, which happens to be Capernaum, Bethsaida, Chorazin, Jesus' country. And of course, and amongst this whole mix, we're beginning to recognise the significance of Sepphoris and Tiberias within that network, but also the significance of the villages which were beyond the direct cultural influence of the small cities of Sepphoris and Tiberias. So what's our evidence? So we start looking for evidence of Nazareth in the literature. So I've mentioned in terms of biblical literature, the examples we have come exclusively from the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, and almost all of the time they're in the phrase Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus from Nazareth. So let's briefly look at them, beginning with Mark. And Mark, I think, only has the one reference. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, was baptized by John in the Jordan. Okay, so it's a location in the Galilee from which he's come. Matthew, of course, has the Holy Family, not that he calls them that, moving to Nazareth after they returned to Eretz Israel following the flight to Egypt. So in Matthew's tradition, Joseph and Mary are natives of Bethlehem. There is no census. They don't go to look for a room at the inn. They're living in a house. The star stops over the house. The Magi come to visit them in their house. It's a totally different story from the one we all know in the children's pageant. So we're told in Matthew's tradition that Joseph made his home in a town called Nazareth, and of course, being Matthew, this has to fulfill something in the Old Testament, even if we can't find the verse in the Old Testament that is meant to be fulfilling. He'll be called a Nazarene. And part of what's going on there is the confusion about the significance of Nazareth and even just the sort of what the meaning of the name is. Gospel of John has two references to Nazareth and Jesus' link with Nazareth, and I think they're particularly interesting because they're kind of side comments, they're parenthetical comments, and they're not particularly favourable comments. Nazareth is a bit of the tradition that John deals with, but is in a sense uncomfortable with to some degree. Philip found Nathanael. Philip, of course, remember, is the guy from Bethsaida, Kaching. He finds Nathanael and says to him, "We've found the one about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." Fascinating, by the way. Not son of Mary, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth. Okay, that's chapter 9 in the new book. Nathanael says to him, "Nazareth? You've got to be kidding. Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Okay, so this is the kind of tradition which is not celebrating Nazareth. Okay, it's not that Nazareth, like Bethlehem, had prophetic pedigree, and so there's cachet for linking Jesus with Bethlehem, town of David, city of prophecy, da-da-da-da-da. Nazareth is Bougainville, and that's probably Australian for, in Australian terminology, bogan is a redneck. Okay, so this is a tiny village no one's heard of. It's got no reputation for anything. Nothing good comes out of Nazareth. So Nazareth survives in John's Gospel as part of the place Jesus comes from, even though there's no theological payoff for that connection. Indeed, as the next slide demonstrates, there's an even more interesting twist to this. Because a little bit later in John's Gospel, we have this debate between Jesus and the crowds, and some are saying, this guy is really the prophet, and others are saying, this is the Messiah, but others are saying, but the Messiah doesn't come from the Galilee, does he? Hasn't the scripture said the Messiah is descended from David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David lived? Okay, so John's Gospel at least is preserving the tradition that says Jesus is from the Galilee, he's not from Bethlehem. Cop that, Matthew. Cop that, Luke. Cop that, many other people subsequently. Okay, so there's a division. And just a few verses later, they replied, "Surely you are not also from the Galilee, are you? Search and you will see, no prophet is to arise from the Galilee." So the tradition of Jesus having a Galilean origin, whether it's Nazareth or some other, we've just died, some other previously, we might need to go to the other mic, this one's just died on us. So the pedigree issue, can I give you the dead one? How quickly will this come good? I think it's right now, yeah. So there's no theological benefit in John's Gospel, and yet this tradition survives that Jesus comes from the Galilee, and in particular from an otherwise unknown village or location called Nazareth. And that's the kind of data that I give particular historical weight to, because there's no theological benefit for invoking the connection with Nazareth. Not surprisingly, it's Luke Acts who really develops the sort of Nazareth story and gives us most of the things that we think we know about Nazareth. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town. It's actually Polis, which is city, and because it was not a city at all in the time, it's a town in the Galilee called Nazareth. A little bit later on, Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth to the city of David called Bethlehem, and that's how Luke gets the right zip code on the birth certificate for Jesus, the prophetic zip code that had to be there. When they'd finished everything and required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. So Luke has bought into the Nazareth tradition pretty strongly, and he continues. Luke chapter 2, towards the end. He went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. His mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Luke chapter 4, the famous practice run for the day of Pentecost, as Jesus goes to the synagogue, which of course didn't exist in the village of Nazareth. He comes to Nazareth where he'd been brought up, and he went to the synagogue on Shabbat, as was his custom. He stood up to read because he was on the roster, and they got up, and because he said things they didn't like, they got up and drove him out of the town, led him to the brow of the hill on which their town was built, so they might hurl him off the cliff. Not only was there no synagogue in Nazareth, but there is no cliff face there either, because the city is not an ancient Greek city built on a hill with an acropolis, as Luke is imagining. Okay, it's a village halfway down the slope, 500 metres from a well, and there are no cliffs within easy walking distance of Nazareth, assuming we have the right location for Nazareth. So that's the biblical data for Nazareth, and it's overwhelmingly Lucan, as well as all those other places where Jesus is simply called Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus from Nazareth. There are 3 references to Nazareth in the infancy Gospel of Thomas. There are 3 other references in Irenaeus against heresies, late 2nd century. There's 1 reference in Justin Martyr, sort of roughly middle of the 2nd century. Nowhere else in early patristic literature, apostolic fathers, apologists, the early church fathers, do we find references to Nazareth. Okay, so we can see where the sort of myth of Nazareth people are coming from. This place seems to only exist for the sake of the Jesus story. Okay, and all those references that I've just alluded to, Gospel of Thomas, Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, they're all clearly derived from Luke. Okay, so we have no reason based on the literature that survives to think that there's any independent Christian memory of Jesus having family links in Nazareth. And I mention that because one of the I think extreme and unsubstantiated claims by the major excavator at the Basilica site in the 1950s and 60s was that there was a continuous presence of the family of Jesus, who of course had all become Christians and continued living in Nazareth for 200 or 300 years, and when the Byzantines arrived was able to point out all the sacred sites, so the Catholic churches got built on the right locations. And he must have been smoking something interesting before he looked at the evidence. Okay. In terms of references to Nazareth outside of early Christian literature, again, it's incredibly limited. There are no mentions of Nazareth in earlier text. Josephus, who's active in the area and mentions some of the other nearby villages, in fact, villages which today are included within the urban area of Nazareth, are named by Josephus, but Nazareth is not mentioned in Josephus. Was it not there? Or was it just not something that he needed to mention? And then we have one fragmentary 4th century inscription. And if you look at that image, the only bits that actually exist are, if I point this the right way around, this little chunk down here, this little piece up there, and this little fragment there. The rest of what you see in that image is archaeological imagination. So we call it reconstruction. Okay? But on the basis of the 3 fragments that we have from Caesarea Maritima, it's relatively clear, and it's agreed, that we have a list of towns which were suitable for the priestly families to move to after the Bar Kokhba revolt. And the interesting one is that at the end here, this word here is Nazareth. Okay, so Nazareth in the 4th century, 300s, is regarded as a pure town suitable for priests to live in when they can no longer live near Jerusalem. Okay, but that's fragmentary to say the least, and that's the earliest reference to Nazareth outside of the Gospels and Acts. Okay, or outside of Christian sources, because we do have the references from the infancy Gospel of Thomas and Irenaeus. Of course, when we get into the Byzantine and Crusader periods, we do get pilgrimage reports, but these don't tell us what Nazareth was like in the 1st century, and they certainly don't substantiate the existence of Nazareth in the 1st century. We're picking up something interesting. Okay, so the textual evidence, hopefully it's not too interesting, the textual evidence is minimal and is overwhelmingly Christian. Except it is clear that certainly by the 4th century, Nazareth was a known location, attested in a fragmentary inscription, Jewish inscription from Caesarea Maritima, and it's seen as a rabbinic city. It's not a Christian centre, it's a rabbinic centre. It's a good place, a safe place, a ritually pure place for good kosher Jewish priests to live. So we're going to have to look for archaeological evidence one way or the other. And there have been a number of controlled, if you like, scientific excavations around Nazareth, just quickly to list them and then to go through them. The Basilica of the Annunciation site was able to be extensively excavated during the 1960s. There were excavations at, and I love this, I love the way we name things, at Mary's Well. There are a number of Mary's wells in Israel, just as there are a number of Moses Springs in Jordan. Okay? Funny that. So Mary's Well, Nazareth, there were significant excavations in 97, 98. The open lands between Nazareth and Sepphoris, Zippori, have been studied, and we'll come to that. There's the Nazareth Village Farm project. There's the International Marian Centre. That sounds nice. And there's the Sisters of Nazareth Convent site. So there's about half a dozen significant, although very small, archaeological excavations that we need to just quickly address. Okay, and just looking at this to highlight what's there. This is the Church of the Annunciation here. This is the Franciscan compound. Join the Franciscans, see the world. This is one of the places you can live. Casanova across the road. The Marian Centre is here. The Sisters of Nazareth are just up this hill. There's a roadway up here, so that's their building there. And Mary's Well is 2 or 3 street blocks over here. Okay. Now the basic argument is going to be that this is the extent of the village of Nazareth in the 1st century, and that the village well was located at a spring about 500 metres away. Okay. Well, that's where. Well, why? That's just.
Why would they locate the town so far away from the well? That's what I'm.
Sure. We don't. Well, I guess we don't know, but the remains we have that are clearly 1st century are from down here. There's nothing in here that fits, and that's where the spring was. That's where the major spring was. And there was a kind of ravine, which is now covered over with modern roads and piping. But this bit of the village here was separated from the spring by a not particularly deep, but a significant, I guess, a gully, we'd call it in Australia. So that's the kind of geography of the place. Okay. Okay. So let's go through each of these sites one by one. This is this modest structure put up by the Roman Catholic community, the Latins, as they're called in Palestine, and it was opened and dedicated by Paul V in the 1960s. Now, the advantage of that was that the 18th century Franciscan church was knocked down and demolished in order to build the new basilica, and the land was taken back to bedrock. Now, that's a unique archaeological opportunity. To take a site which has been a Christian church, built, knocked down, built, knocked down, built, knocked down for more than 1,000 years, and take it down to bedrock before you built the granddaddy of them all. Okay? And so it was carefully studied and analysed, and the lead archaeologist was Bellarmino Bagatti. And he argued for a sort of Jewish Christian presence in Nazareth prior to the Byzantine period, and that was critical for his theory of continuous memory of the correct location of the sites that Jesus' family had occupied, which were then eventually passed on to the Franciscans. Now, he claimed too much, but we're all inclined to do that from time to time. What he did find was significant information, and we'll come back to look at some of that. But what we basically have are a sort of set of cisterns and structures. This is looking at what they've done, and they've done this in a couple of places in the more recent period. They've built the new modern Catholic structure, like a Capernaum, above the archaeological remains. So the church is a little bit like lost in space in the case of say, Capernaum, and even the basilica. When you're walking around underneath, there's an area that's open to the public, but you get this sense of the ancient Nazareth landform underneath, and then this modern church kind of sitting above it. So what we have are a series of limestone caves which have been shaped and carved out and interconnected and appear to have been used both for storage of grain and also at times for shelter, and particularly to hide for defence, protection, when the village is being raided. And there are what they call the sort of shadows, or there are gouges, grooves, I guess you'd call them, in the top of the surface, which appear to be the sort of mirror image of later structures built on top of the sandstone. Okay, so they've carved out a bit of the rock in order to get the wall securely planted. That wall has long since disappeared, but we sort of get the footprint of the later structures which were placed on top of the caves. So this what we have are extensive areas taken back to bedrock. We do have material from the Iron Age through to the early Roman, and so there's clearly there were people here at different times, from Iron Age, which is roughly 1200,000 BCE, down to the early Roman period of the 1st century. We have wine presses and olive presses, and some of these caves have clearly been carved in such a way as to facilitate the processing of wine and olives. Passages connected between the caves so people could move underground from one place to another. Bell-shaped water cisterns, the bell shape is not significant liturgically, it's just the way the cave has been shaped to store water, and silos, some cases caves dug out to 2 or 3 levels of occupation. So these are people living as much underground and using the natural cave structures as building substantial artificial construction on top. Again, this image just picks up some of that shaping of the bedrock to support later buildings. Okay, so this is what's called here the uniform linear rock-hewn depressions are interpreted as the negatives of walls whose stones have been removed, and the general indication is that what we've got here is that domestic buildings may once have stood above the rock-hewn basement silos, and these buildings probably dated from the Roman period. And the consensus of the scholars that have looked at this material is that the sort of modern Franciscan compound is probably the nucleus of the Roman period village, which would have been quite a small village, and we'll come back to that. So down one end of town, if you were, you've got the basilica. 500 metres or so away, you've got the Greek Orthodox Church of St. Gabriel, which is located at Mary's Well. And for the convenience of the tourists, there's another Mary's Well out on the street, so you don't all tramp through the church. So this is the Mary's Well you see as you drive through the main street of Nazareth. The church is up those steps and back another 100 metres or so, and the actual spring is another 100 metres up the hill behind the church. But most people don't get to hear that part of the story. So this is the excavations at Mary's Well and also around St. Gabriel's Church. So there were limited excavations done in 1997 and 98 by Yardena Alexandra. And her report came out in 2012, and I also had a chance to talk with her last year and get some verbal feedback from her. The spring and the well structure connected with it seems to have been about 500 metres away from the actual village area, and is not uncommon in the ancient world for the habitations to be one point and the like Samaritan woman, the women going out to the well and then taking the water back into the village area itself, and that something of that seems to be what's happened here. The natural features of the site meant that you do have a number of springs around Nazareth coming out of the limestone hills, but this was the largest, most substantial water source, and that becomes connected as the well where Mary hears the news that she's pregnant or going to be pregnant. And that's a whole other story. I mean, the historicity of that episode is a whole other question, okay? Interesting things happen to women at wells in sacred stories. They're good meeting places. In Australia, and I'm conscious it's Anzac Day today, we have a tradition of what's called a furphy. I'm not sure if you have that expression in Canada. A furphy is a rumour. And the reason they're called furphies is that in the First World War, the water tank provided to the soldiers was produced by a company called Furphy. And when you went to the Furphy to fill up your water canteen, that's when you caught up with other soldiers and you heard what was going on. So if you had a Furphy, it meant you had some news that wasn't official, but you'd actually got a story from somebody else who was passing on. So this idea of when you go to the water source, that's where you catch up with the gossip. Who's pregnant this week? What? They've been married how long? Whatever. Okay? So it's that kind of stuff. Now, wells are interesting archaeological sites. That's what the well inside the church looks like. As I said, the actual spring is another 100 metres up the hill. I've also been reliably informed that this nice little sample on the basin here, we can have a drink of water from Mary's well, is actually municipal water supply from the city of Nazareth piped in, and actually has nothing at all to do with, because you can't drink the water coming out of the spring. Anyway, it's a beautiful old church, and people feel nice when they go there. Okay, now ancient water systems present particularly interesting archaeological challenges. You're going to find certain kinds of objects at a well, because people use devices to collect water, and they drop particular things in wells. So they lose jewellery, they lose coins, and they drop buckets and containers and jugs and scoops and so on. These are the things you're going to find at a well. You're less likely to find spearheads and so on. Now, if it's a well from a city which has been captured in conflict, you're going to find dead people in the well and dead animals in the well to make the water undrinkable and to force people to move away. But that's not what we're finding in Nazareth. The other thing is, of course, that things will accumulate at the lowest level of the water system. They're going to be flowing down the water system, and the mud and everything else is going to accumulate at the bottom. And they're only going to be cleaned out periodically. The last time the Nazareth well was cleaned out was in the 15th century, until 1997. Okay, so the excavations in 1997 were excavating the silt from just the last 400 or so years of this particular well, during which time it was the main water source for Nazareth, which was a village of not much more than 1,000 to 1,500 people. This is what that beautiful Mary's Well looks like if you walk around the back. And as a would-be archaeologist, I find that much more interesting than the front side of the well. Okay? And when I look at that, I actually don't see the plastic bags and the water bottles and stuff. What I see are different kinds of masonry work, and changes in construction methods and changes in material used in the well suggest different periods in the history of the maintenance. It's like the parish church or the parish hall, where different volunteers have done stuff at working bees over the years. Except this working bee has been going on for hundreds of years. So the well reflects the history of different phases of occupation. So what came out of the well? Well, it wasn't, pussy in the well. What are the things that came out of the well? 165 coins were amongst the items that came out of the well, and my particular interest at Bethsaida is firstly in the coins, and secondly in the evidence of the Islamic occupation from the early Islamic period through to the Ottoman Empire. 16 of the 165 coins were from the Hasmonean and Herodian periods. That's 1st century. Okay. Now the well was last cleaned in the 15th century and presumably was cleaned in the Byzantine period or whatever. So most of the coins that have fallen in the well have of course been recovered at earlier times in history. But enough had been missed that even in 1997, 98, we still got 10% of the coins that came out of the well were first century coins. You don't drop first century coins in the well in the Byzantine period. Okay, so straight away you can see the relevance there for, even though that we'd like there to be 300 first century coins, even one first century coin is enough to seal the deal. Okay. So presumably prior to the 15th century there were many more first century coins, but that's the luck of the archaeologist. You work with what's the random leftovers that happen to survive for whatever combination of reasons. So moving outside of Nazareth, this is the valley between Nazareth and Sepphoris. Okay, the Nahal Zapori, the stream of Sepphoris, which is that little tiny creek running through there. Okay, so this is the open farmland between Sepphoris and Zapori. Ken Dark, an English archaeologist, I think he is the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. I'm thinking of setting up the Australian Israel Archaeological Society, making it a tax-deductible organisation. But Ken has been working for 10, 15 years, particularly around Nazareth and in the space between Nazareth and Sepphoris. And he's done detailed surveys of this valley, this open space, which is still primarily open agricultural land. And he's identified the patterns of settlement in the early Roman period through to the Byzantine period, and his research focus was actually on the Christianization of the landscape in the Byzantine period. Okay, so he wasn't researching Nazareth in the first century, he was trying to identify how the landscape was being developed in the Byzantine period and Christianized in the Byzantine period to serve the needs of the pilgrims that were coming in. Now what he has documented, and I think established quite clearly, is a clear cultural divide running through this valley, so that the villages and the farming settlements that are closer to Zapori or Sepphoris are more integrated into the Hellenistic Gentile world, if you like, and the Jewish settlements, and they're all Jewish settlements, but the settlements that are closer to Nazareth and even further away are less integrated into the Hellenistic, if you like, Gentile, pagan, whatever, Roman cultural system. So the settlements closer to Sepphoris are less observant, more likely to have ceramic material, and less likely to have distinctive Jewish cultural markers, limestone vessels, etc. And the villages and the farms that are further away, closer to Nazareth, are more observant, and their material remains are distinctively Jewish and less inclined to buy Greek, more inclined to buy Jewish when it comes to crockery and so on. And he actually makes the point that this divide is clearer in this valley than anywhere else in the Roman Empire, although it would also have been true in other areas in France and England and so on. But he's claiming it's clearer here than anywhere else in the Roman Empire. Mentioning that because it's reflecting patterns of intentional Torah-observant Jewish settlement in the region of Sepphoris, but outside of the immediate orbit of Sepphoris, even though we're only talking about, say, 5 kilometres or so between Sepphoris and Nazareth. Fourth one, the Nazareth Village Project, or the Nazareth Village Farm Project. As it turned out, there was a small plot of undeveloped land immediately below the so-called English Hospital. That's the hospital set up by the London Missionary Society. It's across the road from the French hospital, set up by the Catholics. And so this block of land was, we're all in there competing with each other. There's nothing like it. So as if you just look at that shot, there's a small parcel of land, just a few acres, which actually had not been built on, ever. Okay? Which is remarkable. There's incredible pressure for urban land use in Nazareth. And here's a little patch of land, just a couple of acres, that had not ever been built over. Whereas you can see the kind of modern developments that are going on all around it with sort of 5-6 level houses, departments, and of course that's 5 brothers each living on a different floor with their wife and children. That's how you do your housing in this part of the world. So what's going on in the Nazareth village farm? So it's a rare open space, and they discovered there was a sort of wine, an ancient wine press there. They also, interestingly, found a small limestone cave with a rolling stone. The rolling stone is not a dirty, great big boulder, but a stone disc in a groove, like a sliding door that you can roll shut. So all those Sunday school drawings are wrong, but we knew that for other reasons anyway. So what they've developed on this site is a working model first century Galilean farm. So it's an interesting place to visit. But as the process of setting up that farm, they did a detailed archaeological study of the site, and in particular how the farming practices on this site were in ancient times. What appears to be the case that this is only 500 metres the other way from the Franciscan compound. And if you know, well, it's the land between the English hospital and the YMCA. So it's about 500 metres the other direction from the Franciscan compound. There were no evidence of domestic structures, but lots of pottery. People going out from the village to work in the fields, dropping the occasional bit of ceramic waste. Mostly late Roman and lots of Byzantine. So it reflects, larger presence in the Byzantine period, but some late Roman, which means after the Herodian period. Okay, we're talking 2nd, 3rd century, not 1st century. Some Hellenistic and early Roman pottery, but not very much, and basically no coins. The only coins are from the Byzantine and later period, and it's consistent with farming outside the ancient village area. So again, it confirms that there was the main period of flourishing was in the Byzantine period, but there was some presence prior to that, but not significant presence. Again, we're in the vicinity of the Basilica. I'm really standing at the Basilica gate as I take this photograph. I'm a self-obsessed Anglican, so I'm taking a photograph of Christ Church, ye little bit of England church, just up the road from the Basilica. Probably at the time it was built, it was as big as the Franciscan church, but then the Romans knocked down the Franciscan church and built a new basilica. So now Christ Church is in the shadow of the basilica. Halfway between the basilica and Christ Church is the convent of the Sisters of Nazareth. It is that little green sign on the right-hand side of the street. Okay, just there. That's the entrance. Okay. Now, the Sisters of Nazareth was a religious order, I think a French order, that came out in the 19th century as part of the massive expansion of Christian European presence in places like Nazareth during the expansion of European colonial influence in the declining decades of the Ottoman Empire. So what do we have at, or more importantly, under the Sisters of Nazareth convent? It's about 100 metres from the basilica, and as early as 1884, when the sisters were building their convent, they discovered ancient materials. Unfortunately, they were not studied properly. And one of the consequences of that is that the material was grossly exaggerated and then dismissed, and people haven't paid a lot of attention to it. More recently, Ken Dark has made it a particular focus for his research, and he's published both a monograph as well as several technical papers on the material. It's quite clear there are significant Byzantine materials, and that's the primary thing that Ken is more a sort of Byzantine historian. But he's noted that underneath the Byzantine material there are some 1st century remains. And the basic argument is that the Sisters of Nazareth convent represents one boundary of 1st century Nazareth, with the basilica being more or less the other boundary. And we're talking about something about 150 metres by 150 metres. That's about it for 1st century Nazareth. So he points in particular to a structure that he calls Structure 1. Now, most of the interest in the Sisters of Nazareth site is an even lower level which is this rolling stone tomb. If you want to see a really good rolling stone tomb, this is it. There's the rolling stone. It's a disc. It's about 8 inches thick. It sits in a groove, and you'll notice there's a couple of pebbles helpfully put there to make sure the stone does not roll closed after you go inside. These days you're not allowed inside. When I was first there 20 years ago, we were allowed to go inside, lie down in the tomb and take photos, and they're a bit more precious about their, and rightly so, about their materials these days. But it's actually a really significant first century tomb, and this style of tomb was only used between 50 BCE and 50 CE. So it gives us a very interesting window. The romantic story is this is the tomb that Jesus carved for his stepfather. That's of course nonsense, but it's a nice romantic story. We don't know why this tomb was there. And typically, of course, Jewish custom, you do not put burial sites inside the village boundary. So if nothing else, the presence of these tombs, and there are 3 or 4 others in this immediate site, indicate that this was one of the boundaries for the village of Nazareth at one point in history. Because once you get to the graveyard, you're out of town in a Jewish world. It was different in other cultures. Okay, this is the piece de resistance. This is structure 1. And what we're dealing with there, this is just a sort of panorama photo, what we're dealing with is a first century cave house, a human dwelling, partly constructed by taking a cave and then modifying it, and the vertical shape over there is a narrow doorway out into the first century street. Okay, so when you're standing in this area, which is now roped off because you're not allowed to go there anymore, but if you go into this area and through that doorway, as I've done in the past, you're actually stepping out of a first century Nazareth house into the street. Okay, running parallel to the modern street, but a couple of metres further over. And as you can see, that site has been built upon and built upon and built upon by layers of Byzantine and Crusader Christian presence, the most recent being the Sisters of Nazareth in the 19th century. So we're talking about a tiny dwelling, typical of a very modest level of human occupation, perhaps in the early stage of a farming settlement. So we have what Ken Dark has identified now as a well-preserved, believe it or not, a well-preserved example of a first century courtyard house, similar to another one we'll look at in a moment at the International Marian Centre, just 100 metres or so away. It had plastered walls. Some of the artefacts that are found there suggest Jewish domestic occupation, including spinning, and reflects a modest but Torah-observant Jewish family. The International Marian Centre is that glorious building in the distance, and you can a different angle. This is not the street perspective that most visitors to Nazareth get to see. So what are we dealing with here? This is a new visitor centre established in 2011, and of course what happens in Israel, you start to dig the foundations for a new building and you run into archaeological material. Whether you're building a road, whether you're building a pit to put your tank, or whether you're preparing foundations for a new building, archaeological rescue excavations are an important part of the study of the history of Israel. So across the street from the Basilica, and in a sense, not exactly in a straight line between the Basilica and the Sisters of Nazareth, but in that same space, they discovered these remains of ancient buildings, which then had to be excavated as they were in 2008-2009. The excavator was the same Yardena Alexandra who I mentioned earlier, and I've spoken with her because the report has not yet been published. Now, the non-publication of the report is seen by some people as a typical Israeli Roman Catholic conspiracy. It's just that archaeological reports take a long time to publish. And it's one thing to get funding to do the rescue excavation so the building can go ahead. It's another thing to get the funding to do all the research and analysis and publish the report. So what we appear to have is, again, evidence of a first century courtyard house occupied by Jewish people, as evidence from the limestone or chalk vessels they were particularly used by Jewish people because they maintained purity, and it's one of the 6 or 7 ethnic markers or cultural markers for a Jewish archaeological site. This is just to give you a sense of what it looks like. Across the road in the top is the basilica. Then you get a stone fence, about 3 metres high. Then you get the modern road, which is here. And then you get the excavations underway below what is now the International Marian Centre. Just to look at those excavations again, what you're dealing with here, it's the same picture basically. So over here we've got similar kind of stuff as we've seen under the basilica, because the photos we're looking at before are from under here. So just 50 to 100 metres away, we've got more of the same kind of network of limestone caves, cisterns, evidence of buildings being originally on top of those structures. And also in this case, Mamluk period, which is basically 1250 to 1517, approximately. And so these Mamluk walls reflect another layer of occupation in the 13th, 14th, 15th century. And now when I look at those walls, I recognise some of my walls at Bethsaida, which are also at the Mamluk period, and they're exactly the same style of construction, exactly the same width. Without even getting a measuring stick, I could almost guarantee those walls are 1.1 metre wide. That's exactly the kind of structure they were doing in the Mamluk period at Bethsaida as well. Oops, wrong button. Okay, so under the International Marian Centre we have more cave structures using the natural features of the limestone, which tends to have spaces, caves, cisterns and so on, primarily to store grain, but also places you can hide when the bandits come through. So this is a small and fragile community, but by the 1st century, apparently an intentional Jewish community, but very small. Then there's the question of tombs and graves. A number of grave sites, burial sites, have been identified on the slope around the ancient village of Nazareth. Not all of them, in fact virtually none of them, are fully published as yet, but they give us a sense of the boundaries. The village had to be smaller than the locations of the cemeteries, because graves were always outside. Significantly, all of these graves are only used from the Herodian period onwards. They're not graves that go back to the Hellenistic period or back to the Iron Age period. These are graves being used from the 1st century onwards, and there's no continuity between the artefacts in these graves and the other evidence of occupation in the Iron Age and even the Bronze Age period. So what are we dealing with? These are some of the artefacts from the Basilica site that are in the small museum, and amongst the most significant things that there are at least 5 distinctive Herodian oil lamps in that collection. And Herodian oil lamps are a particular cultural marker, A, of Jewish identity, and secondly, Jewish identity in the Herodian period. This is one of the ways you demonstrated your Jewishness, by using this particular style of lamp. So what are we dealing with? 1st century Nazareth, a site where there was occasional human presence from the Stone Age and indeed possibly even from the Bronze Age. Permanent occupation appears to begin in the Herodian period. We're talking about a very small settlement, perhaps only a couple of 100 metres, or maybe, if you like, 500 metres by 500 metres. Okay? And the normal calculation is a square kilometre, 300 people. Okay? That would give us only 150 people in Nazareth. Now there might have been 200 or 300, but the normal rule of thumb is 300 people per square kilometre for this kind of settlement. They appear to be observant Jews from Judea, recently arrived to settle in agricultural villages, a place which is clearly too small and too early in its development to have a synagogue building for Jesus to breed in and preach in Luke chapter 4. Possibly sufficient development to have a communal oven, a communal wine press and a communal threshing floor. But otherwise you did everything in your own small cave house. Not more than 300 people. I think James Strange suggests 480 people. I don't know how he gets that level of precision in his population estimate, but if you, as I said, if you take the normal rule of thumb, it'd be less than 200 people. And most of them, again, putting our thinking caps on, thinking about the sexuality and contraception options available, most of the 300 people are going to be children. Okay? Given what we know about mortality rates, given what we know about human survival, in an agricultural village of 300 people, most of those 300 are not going to be adults. So we might be talking of no more than 25 families, even possibly fewer families, making up first century Nazareth. So the quest, if you like, for the Nazareth that Jesus might have known results in a very modest but distinctively Jewish first century agricultural village, living in the shadow of Sepphoris, but choosing to locate itself culturally and spiritually in the shadow of the temple. And that invites us to rethink some of the reconstructions of the historical Jesus as an Israelite from the north who was shared the northern antipathies to the temple. Because the kind of Jewish settlements cropping up in the Galilee, which include Bethsaida in this period, in the Herodian period, were in fact deeply attached, according to the material evidence, to the temple and to the Herodian system in the south.